Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Climate Now Live here on Euronews YouTube channel. My name is Jeremy Wilkes, and we are here to talk about COP27. What's next? That is the climate summit that just finished last weekend. And we know there were declarations, there were agreements, an awful lot was said. But really, we're going to unpack a little bit what happened during that event and talk about the future between now, COP27 and COP28 next year. What needs to happen? What's the state of the climate? We've got a great selection of guests as well. Let's introduce them. We're going to be talking about all kinds of topics related to COP27, the politics of it, what it was like to be there, but also, as I say, the science of where we are in terms of our atmosphere, what we understand about the trajectories that we're now on and what we need to do to try and improve the situation. Joining me are Lídia Pereira, who's a Portuguese MEP with the European People's Party, and she was one of the delegation of members of the European Parliament who actually attended COP27. Thanks very much for being with us, Lídia. Carlo Buontempo, also the director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service. Hello, Carlo. Nice to see you.
Hi, Jeremy.
Lars Riishøjgaard, who's the director of Earth System Branch at the World Meteorological Organization. Hello, Lars Peter.
Hi there, Jeremy.
And Moisio, who leads the Climate Action Tracker project at the NewClimate Institute. Thanks very much for being with us, Mia, as well.
Hello.
So I'm going to start with a little bit of a vote. I want everybody to give me a kind of a rating out of 10 on the level of success or they saw from COP27. Obviously, I'm a journalist. I'm not supposed to give my points of view on this sort of thing. But has anybody got in mind a number when I say that, rated out of 10? Lídia, if I come to you first, how do you say it went?
Hello, good morning. I would rate it with a 6. We had some progress, but we are far from what we should have achieved during this year, during COP27.
I'll come back to you on some of that. Carlo, can I get a view from you?
I was thinking of a 6 myself. It was going to be a difficult COP anyway, and I think something has been achieved, notwithstanding the condition, but certainly it fell short of the aspiration of many.
Lars Peter?
I'd go a little bit lower, maybe with a 5. I think for some of the stuff that I care about, it was actually quite successful, but I think, and it was successful for the developing countries in terms of what we actually need to do to get this under control. It was not successful. So we're somewhere in the middle.
Mia?
I would agree with Lars. I would also go with a 5. I think the COP was really, a two-sided coin. We had on one side this massive victory for loss and damage and for developing countries, indeed. But when it comes to actually addressing climate change, there was no movement. So really 5 out of 10.
Yeah, if somebody were to ask me, I probably would have been in that sort of area as well. But as I say, I'm a journalist. I'm not supposed to have opinions about these sorts of things. One of the things that was missing, though, was the demonstrators. I mean, we were all there. We all had that experience of being at Sharm el-Sheikh. I want to show you a little video, though, because there was a mini demonstration, one moment, and I filmed it badly on my phone. But let's have a little look at it. This is a demonstration related to loss and damage, which was really one of the big wins, I think, that we had from Sharm el-Sheikh. That hopefully Mr. Director can put.
I am from the Philippines. More than 10 years ago, Typhoon Haiyan ravaged more than the eastern part of our country and killed more than 5,000 people, destroyed countless jobs in livelihood and agriculture. It's been 10 years. That was the event that triggered the discussion on loss and damage.
There we go. That man obviously extremely passionate about what he's talking about. That was, as far as I saw from Sharm el-Sheikh, the only demonstration that happened. I was there the first week. Did anybody else see any other demonstrations when they were there?
I mean, there were 2, 3, 4, 5 people who advocated for to go vegan outside every morning, but it was a handful of people. They were very nicely dressed and handed out folders, but it always seemed like they were there to show that demonstrators were allowed. It was very minimal.
Yeah, absolutely. Lídia, can I bring you in on loss and damage? This is claimed as a major moment. Can you just say from your point of view as a politician, how significant is what happened there on loss and damage?
Well, I think we all know that developing countries have been asking for financial support, and in particular for loss and damage, to money to rebuild the infrastructures of countries that are most suffering with extreme weather events. So this has been a plea for a long time. Achieving the fund, the agreement on the fund, is indeed a milestone. But now there's the difficult part of where there is not yet an agreement on how to finance, how the finance should be provided and where it should come from. And one point that I want to make in relation to loss and damage. We have to have a long-term perspective in dealing with climate change. And if we don't have the necessary steps towards climate mitigation, whatever we do on loss and damage will be just with, a one-off approach, because we are not dealing with the problem in a sustainable way. So I think on the one hand, yes, indeed, it is positive, the achievement of the agreement. But on the other hand, it does not solve the issue, because I think we are still failing on taking actions or concrete actions on mitigation. And let me tell you this, we had several meetings during our stay in Sharm el-Sheikh, and one of them was particularly important to us, which was to hear from the IPCC chair, Mr. Lee, telling us, whatever we do on loss and damage will never be sufficient if we don't address mitigation. And on this particular topic, I think COP27 was far from being successful. And therefore, there's a lot still to be done for next year. But the time, the clock is ticking, and year by year, we are, postponing, or we are pushing back the necessary measures that we have to take to address this problem globally.
Absolutely. I mean, I've actually got the document here from Sharm el-Sheikh, which I have read through, and I guess everybody else here has had a bit of a look at it too. But for those of you who haven't looked at it, you can find it online quite easily. On loss and damage, they say that those who, the countries signing this piece of paper, say they note with grave concern the growing gravity, scope and frequency in all regions of loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So, we admit that there's a problem, basically, but then the second part of it is welcomes the consideration for the first time of matters relating to funding arrangements responding to loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. So it's basically agreeing that you're going to have a chat about opening an account, but it's going to look a bit like my bank account and not be particularly full at the moment. Mia, you've been following this. What's your feeling on loss and damage? I mean, a lot of people say too little too late for everything. This one seems a little bit like it's okay, we've just started a new thing, but it's already too little.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, as Lídia mentioned, I mean, at the moment we have, we have a fund, but we don't have any money in it. So it could be your bank account, or, I mean, it's still looking quite empty. But I just want to stress that it is a breakthrough. It really is a breakthrough for the civil society organizers, people in the global south who've been campaigning for this for years and years, for decades. And I think, one thing that is new this year is that, and over the past couple of years, is that we're really witnessing already now the climate emergency. I mean, we saw the thousands of people who've suffered and the many who've died in the floods in Pakistan, in the wildfires. I think all of that has really, woken us up to this new reality that we're living in. So it's really important that we see this loss and damage fund. But again, if you're not doing more action to tackle the causes of climate change, that also means more money for loss and damage. So clearly, we also need to address the causes of climate change.
Carlo, I see you nodding on this. What's the kind of scientist point of view on what happened there?
Well, I was nodding because I think it's opening a very interesting and new area of science and research, because loss and damage, up to a certain extent, requires to make statement about how worse things have gone and link those impact to climate change. And so this is the science of climate change attribution is relatively young and moving faster, but is becoming a societal requirement now, and the fact that it was approved, aside from what Mia was saying, that is certainly very important from civil society. I think it's also exciting from a prospect of climate science, because it imposed on us a new challenge, a new responsibility to make this attribution statement, or put in the context of climate change some of the extreme events that we have seen happening.
Reading between the lines, then you're thinking that basically what now when we're going to move forward from this and next year and the year after, of trying to understand how you implement this concept, the people are going to be coming to you at Copernicus and saying, okay, can you give us some numbers on this or some percentages on this? The X disaster happened. What's the climate change component? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, and we have seen some of it happening already with the activities of the World Weather Attribution, for instance. You have the Pakistani floods, or you have the heat wave in Europe, or tropical cyclones. And then the question it's a question that journalists like you, Jeremy, keep asking us every time in the aftermath of an extreme event: was this climate change? And we often say, well, you cannot attribute a single event to climate change, but this class of events has become more common because of climate change. And I think, in a sense, the discussion on loss and damage is just raising the bar. It's not just sufficient to say it has become more likely because of climate change. We need to be a bit more specific, because there will be a pressure from the country that have been experiencing those extreme events to go with a claim and say, well, actually, this flood would have been impossible had not been for climate change, and we have the backing of the science. And it's not necessarily, the science is not necessarily all there yet, but it's developing fast, and is an area certainly of expansion, and and there is definitely a new attention to that topic. And
there's certainly, as soon as World Weather Attribution come out with something, as soon as they send me a press release, everybody tends to jump on it, because it's true that the speed now of response that they have is extraordinary. Although we as journalists have a bit of trouble with their percentages sometimes. They say, this was made 3 to 19% more likely, and that sounds quite large if you're a journalist. You don't know where to really to kind of cite that, but it's fascinating. Lars, Peter, can I bring you in on loss and damage from your point of view as a scientist? How do you see it?
I agree completely with what Lídia said in this. Loss and damage is good. It's a breakthrough. It's a political breakthrough that we acknowledge that we've done some damage to the atmosphere, and we need to help the poorest deal with that. But it is a Sisyphus task if we don't tackle the mitigation. Loss and damage will just keep accumulating, and this is not really this is not sustainable. So the reason why I was disappointed with the COP was that we did not really address the other half of it, which is mitigation. What do we do to what do we do to stop this slowly unfolding train wreck?
Basically, nothing new happened on mitigation. Is that right, Lídia? From my reading of things, nothing new happened.
No, nothing relevant was achieved, and so, there is. I want to stress out this idea. Without any success on climate mitigation, we don't. This was the reason why COP27 was not a good COP for the planet or for the humanity. And I think one of the lessons learned from this COP is that we still need to go further in multilateralism, with a multilateral approach. We have to insist on the dialogue. Multilateralism was very successful after Second World War and after the Cold War, and therefore we need to invest more on this dialogue. And I'm saying this because, well, the US has a special envoy for environment, John Kerry. Europe has Vice President Timmermans, who takes the lead in negotiating this, but we have to insist on climate diplomacy. And Europe, we have been saying that we are the leaders in the fight against climate change, but we also have to act as ones, as a leader. And therefore, we need either to create this figure of a special envoy as well to do climate policy, diplomacy on a regular basis during the whole year, like that can visit the countries and have targeting only this agenda. Because I know that in this...
just bring in a quote, actually, that we from the end of that event in Sharm el Sheikh, there was a quote from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who said COP27 has confirmed that the world will not backtrack on the Paris Agreement, which the fact she even said that seems worrying, that there were a lot of conversations there at COP this year that were pushing in the direction of backtracking on Paris.
Absolutely. There were countries that wanted to undermine the Paris Agreement for 1.5 degrees. So this was actually on the table, to remove the references for 1.5, and I think this is worrying. That's why I'm insisting on investing even more in climate diplomacy, because I don't think that countries are aware of the consequences of not taking action now. We are going to witness many more.
It's not like they haven't been told, though, is it? I mean, they've had 30 years of climate science reports and scientists telling them what's going to happen.
But still, you know that we tend to live on the present, and we are very difficult to anticipate the future. And I think people still didn't understand that this will have a huge impact on future generations. There's this beautiful text. I will invite you all and the people that are following us today. There's this beautiful text written by Margaret Atwood, which is fiction, but I think it can be the reality in the future. She basically tries to see ourselves in the next 100 years, and to explain the community's access, for example, to water, to food. And that's the reason why I'm saying that we are still not able to actually address the priority that climate mitigation is. And we are just trying to compensate with these small little agreements, which are obviously positive, but are far from the ideal.
I'm going to just read through a couple of, sticking with the politics on this, some of the headlines that we got from the media from COP27. The Guardian, the British newspaper that's read globally, said the world is still on the brink of climate catastrophe after the COP27 deal. Politico said, death on the Nile. They need to work on their geography, but otherwise I get the sentiment. COP27 between hope and despair was Le Monde's take on it. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C has become a hollow phrase after the climate summit, said Volkskrant, the Dutch newspaper. And then Heated, which is a great online source of information, particularly from the US, said without a global commitment to phase out or even phase down the use of fossil fuels, the COP27 deal is nonsensical. We saw this kind of hint towards gas as well in that document. What did you make of that? This low carbon is what they were talking about rather than zero.
Well, that's clearly of concern, and we've seen over the past year, particularly now with the global energy crisis, we've seen many governments really pushing for gas. It's really like a gold rush for gas that we're witnessing. It's more pipelines that have been announced, more exploration into new gas, more LNG terminals in particular. And we see that if all of these plans really materialize, then we are really endangering, even already more than what it already is, the 1.5 degree temperature limit. So clearly, if all of these plans go forward, we're nowhere near able to limit global warming to 1.5 degree. Just going back to your question on 1.5, I think there also we had all of us a little bit of a heart attack with these discussions on the 1.5 degree. It's still alive after COP, yes, but I'd say it's in very much in intensive care. And
it's 1.5 that had the heart attack, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can I just bring up, you've got a very nice graphic, which I'd like you to talk us through, which kind of explains some of the ambition, where we're going, the reality, I suppose. You can see the 1.5 on there. Just explain this and talk us through it.
Yeah, so this is the annual temperature estimates that we produce at the Climate Action Tracker. And here you can see we track action by the world's largest emitters on the policies they're taking to to reduce, to meet their targets, but also then the climate targets that they put forward to limit global warming. And the first figure you can see in blue here on the left is where we're actually heading. And here you can see we're heading to 2.7 degrees of warming with the actions that governments are taking by the end of the century. And this is really catastrophic global warming. I mean, here we're really talking about what UN Secretary General mentioned is a highway to climate hell. Really, we're still extremely far from the 1.5 degree goal at 2.7 degrees of warming with the action that we're taking. Now, we also track the government targets put in place, so that you can see here in purple the 2030 targets. So that's in climate jargon, the nationally determined contributions put forward.
Is that everybody's 2030? That's not just Europe. That's
everyone. That's
everybody.
Yeah, all the targets put forward. And this is the exact same estimate that we had last year, 2.4 degrees. So we've seen very little movement. There was a call in Glasgow for all governments to update their targets, but only a few did. And out of the major emitters, almost none did more this year. So that's really of concern, and we need to do more by COP28 to really redress this situation. Then the pledges and targets that you can see here, the light blue line getting us to 2 degrees of warming. That's if you look at all the binding long-term and net zero targets put forward by governments. And then we have our most optimistic scenario there on the right, getting us to 1.8 degrees of warming. So that is getting a little bit closer to 1.5, but it's still not there. And I would just want to add a word of caution here. This is all the announced net zero targets, but we see that, out of the countries that have announced that they will reach net zero, many of them still lack any concrete plan as to how to actually get there. So this is really optimistic and should be taken with a grain of salt. So
yeah. I mean, it's somebody, no, I was talking to Bertrand Piccard, the guy who flew around the world on the solar-powered plane, and he said at COP, and he said to me, well, it's kind of like the alcoholic who says, I'm going to stop drinking tomorrow. These net zero targets are a little bit like that, of like, okay, well, we'll see that when it happens. Carlo, can I bring you in? I note, Carlo, that you've just gone and put on a sweater. Which must mean that you've turned down the heating. I'm also wearing my green jumper here. Here at Euronews, we've cut the heating. We're trying to do our bit, and honestly, it's cold. What does it
in the parliament as well?
Really? Okay.
Yes.
We got no hot water. Everybody's walking around with a scarf. What does 2.7 degrees of warming look like, Carlo? Because we're at 1.2 now. It's not great. What does 2.7 look like?
Well, I mean, it's not me telling it. It has been depicted quite clearly in the IPCC, in the last assessment report, both in Working Group 1 and in the Working Group 2. And a large, an unmitigated, let's say, scenario, an increase in global temperature of that order of magnitude translate into impact that are very significant for us as humans, but they are very significant for the planet as a whole. So impact on the biodiversity, impact on sea level, impact on heat waves. I mean, we are coming out of the warmest summer on record in Europe. This was actually record-breaking after the warmest summers on record last year. So, and once again, the question was, should we expect more of those? And unfortunately, the answer is quite straightforward. Yes, we can expect more of those. And in the foreseeable future, this would become more common, longer, more intense than they have been. And there is not really much we can do to reduce that risk over the next couple of decades. So in a sense, we are looking at the far future. And there, the difference between 1.5 or 2.7 is quite significant. And remember that
I'm going to bring up the European annual surface air temperature anomaly graphic that we have. This is actually not the most up-to-date one, I'm afraid. We don't have the 2021 figure on there, but that goes back to 1950. Talk us through what we can see there.
Well, this is the anomaly just at the European level, and something that came out in a report this year. So actually was released a few weeks ago, a joint report of C3S and the World Meteorological Organization about the the state of the climate in Europe is that Europe as a continent has warmed faster than any other WMO region over the last 30 years. So basically over the last 30 years, Europe has gone up by roughly half a degree per decade. So very fast warming. That wasn't the case in the period 1960-1990. Actually, Europe was slower than other regions in that period, but recently has really warmed up. So several reasons for it.
Do we know why, Carlo? Do we have any explanation?
Well, I think we have some explanation. I don't think there is a silver bullet. As in many cases with the climate system, climate is complicated and there are many drivers. But there are some plausible drivers. So the loss of sea ice, for instance, in the European Arctic has certainly exposed the ocean to the direct effect of the radiation from the sun, decreasing the albedo, so increasing the temperature, the loss of snow on the mountains and glaciers on the mountain, the loss of moisture in the soil that has increased the soil feedback. So there are a number of processes that at a regional level may have played an important role. There is also a fluctuation, a statistical fluctuation. So this time, in the last 30 years, Europe may have been faster than other regions in warming up. But the important element is that all regions actually have warmed up faster in the last 30 years with respect to the previous one. And this is quite a strong and well-established element. So
that kind of takes me to a question that we like to ask climate scientists, but they don't like to answer, which is whether climate change is kind of going faster, actually, than was predicted or projected in the past.
Well, I like to flip the question around a bit, because for many years, climate scientists have been told to be dramatic, to be over dramatic, to cause panic without reason. And then this summer, actually, the comment was the opposite, saying, well, you were wrong because you were too cautious. So in a sense, I think in the balance of things, climate projection and the work that climate scientists have done has been a good guidance. If you look at the projection back from the 90s or the early 2000s, okay, depending on the decade you look at, there might be some small fluctuation in one direction or the other, but the general picture is really well established. And so I take it as a measure of success. So clearly we can do better, and a new model will be more precise, and we can improve on things. But it's been incredibly valuable as a tool. So we've been quite correct in predicting what to expect. So at the beginning of this century, we were saying, well, in the 2020s, what is now a normal heat wave will become actually a cold year, and this is pretty much what's happening. And so, in a sense, one of the issues with climate projections is that you don't have the verifying observation. It's not like weather prediction that you say, well, I told you that it was going to rain, it rained, but you can rely on it. But now we start to have a long enough series of projections that you can verify against. So if you look at 20 years ago, we were saying pretty much what's happening now. So I think this should increase the level of trust you can attach to this projection now, when we say, well, 2022 was the warmest summer on record and we had this terrible heat wave. This won't be exceptional in 20 years' time. And in 30, 40 years' time may actually be a cold summer for Europe. So given that these are...
Lídia, can I quickly bring in you? You were part of that delegation of MEPs who went to COP. You're obviously engaged on climate issues. Do you consult the science and read the reports about the state of our climate? Do you guys talk about it inside the corridors of power of Brussels, I suppose?
Absolutely, and it's also reflected in our positions, in particular in the resolution that we every year approve as the Parliament's position for COPs in general. So obviously we follow science. I come from a political group that trusts science very much. So I have that. I don't deny any of the signals pointed out by the several studies that have been put forward in relation to climate change. What I want to once again bring to the discussion is two things. One is that I think Europe is actually doing a lot more than other geographies in the world. And this has to be said, and we should be proud of that, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep investing on climate diplomacy and have this spokesperson dedicated to the topic, making climate diplomacy around the world. The second is the climate ambition. Obviously the agreement for loss and damage is positive. but it doesn't serve the purpose if we have islands being completely washed off, or if we have Africa turning into a desert, with all the associated problems that it brings in terms of, for example, migration, in terms of people's displacement. So that's the reason why I want to insist on the importance of mitigation, and obviously with all the scientific data that allows us as policymakers to adopt better measures and doing better policy making. We definitely have to have insist on the climate ambition, but bringing the other geographies for this challenge. And I'm referring in particular to China and India. They are also big CO2 emitters. And if they don't understand that they also have to take action, because we cannot alone, Europe cannot alone, and we see this discussion in the parliament, we see some political groups very much wanting to go, further, the next level in climate change, but we are doing a lot already. What we have to bring is, or to convoke the other countries that are responsible for the course of climate change, to be on our side in addressing the problem, and not just creating some measures or some agreements to shadow or to overshadow the main problem, which is in the long-term perspective. Yeah. And I still think when we talk about sustainability, we should not talk about it because it's a very important topic, or even sometimes we even address it in a patronizing way. We have to be consequent with our actions, and sustainability is for the long term. And that's why I think Europe really has to bring the other countries to be part of the solution, and that puts a lot of pressure for next year.
For sure, absolutely. For Dubai is going to be a big one. And I want to talk to Lars Peter about the global stock take. But quickly, can I bring in Mia? Your view on Lydia's just saying Europe's doing a good job. Do you think it's doing a good job?
Well, I would bring in the global perspective and just highlight the fact that no major emitter is yet doing enough. We at the Climate Action Tracker, we rate the policies and action of all major emitters, and not one of them is doing enough to meet the 1.5 degree temperature limit and the goals of the Paris Agreement. So here also the EU could be doing a lot more. And we saw, for example, the EU this year failed to take the leadership that was expected of it to really get us to an ambition cycle and make sure that COP27 would be a success. In the second week of the COP, we saw Timmermans, the climate Vice President of the European Commission, announced that the EU would increase its target, or could increase its target, from at least 55% to at least 57%. But this came it was really too little, too late in the process to make sure that everyone would get on board. So what we really need to see now going into COP28 is the EU early enough already now in 2023 putting forward a target, agreeing on a much more ambitious target. Ideally, it would go even well beyond 57%. We've done some analysis and we've shown that the EU could go beyond 57 with the measures that it is discussing. So that would be important to get that diplomatic effort that we need to have a more ambitious COP28.
I'd certainly read some opinion pieces that 57% figure was kind of a bit of a playing around with the accounting anyway, to go from 55 to 57, but they needed to turn up with something symbolic. But at the end of the day, the atmosphere doesn't really care. The atmosphere is getting more and more CO2 concentrations in it, more methane in it. Let's bring up this graph that we've got here. Now, this is for Europe. This shows that there has been some movement. Lars Peter, can you talk us through this one?
I could, but I don't think this is the significant graphic in a way.
It probably got the wrong one up.
Let me speak to it anyway. It talks about what Europe is doing in terms of emissions, and this is all well and good. It actually supports some of what Lydia was saying about that Europe is in some ways leading the pack here. But if you look at the global concentration, which I know you also have a graphic of, you can see that is steadily going up, both for methane and CO2. And as I like to say, the climate system reacts to what is in the atmosphere. It doesn't react to what individual countries or individual groups of countries claim that they're emitting or claim that is offsetting whatever they're emitting. The atmosphere knows how much is in it, and this is very steadily creeping up. So we are collectively not doing enough. I think it is true what Mia is saying, that no one country or group of countries is doing enough. And there's a lot of disagreement among the different parties to the COP about who should be doing what.
This is the graphic we were talking about, right?
This is the graphic that we're talking about, and this tells you the problem that we're up against. So this spans about 15 years of COP discussion and pledging this, that, and the other, and we can see that we are on a very steady increase, actually, in both CO2 and methane, which are the two most important greenhouse gases. So behind all the individual successes that we tend to want to declare after every single COP, and all the gamesmanship, quite frankly, about offsetting emissions and shady accounting practices, this is what is actually happening in the atmosphere, and this is what we should be worried about. This is not a particularly dramatic figure, perhaps at a first glance, but this is the one that counts. This is the one that is driving the climate system.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's so much uncertainty as well. And I want to bring up something that you presented when you were at COP, which was talking about in relation to the fact that we have this global stock take that's going on at the moment. We know within the Paris Agreement we need to do that every 5 years, right? We need to show that we have made progress in terms of reducing emissions, but there's a lot of things that we don't know. And can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because as far as I'd understood, there's a huge part on the nature side where we really have a large amount of uncertainty.
Yes, we know what is in the atmosphere. So the top part of the graphic here in the green oval tells you the top level budget. So on the left, you have the total emissions, and we claim that we know this reasonably accurately. In the middle, you have how much is the greenhouse gas content in the atmosphere growing by. We know that extremely accurately. And the right-hand side is how much then disappears and is taken up by nature, which is basically the difference between the two figures on the left-hand side. We don't know too much about where it goes. We think that half of it is taken up by the land surface and half of it is taken up by the ocean. But we don't know exactly when and where. And more importantly, we don't know how long that will continue. We know that until now, we know that fairly accurately, that nature has been able to suck up about half the excess emissions due to human activities of CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide. We also know that the way that nature does that changes with the changing climate. So we cannot bank on the fact that nature will continue to suck up half of what we emit. So there are some uncertainties there that we really, really need to understand better in order to give unequivocal guidance to the parties to the Paris Agreement about what is enough in terms of mitigation activity.
I don't really understand, Lars. Why is it that we don't understand that part of nature? Is it we're just not doing enough observation?
The climate system is immensely complicated. So I worked most of my career in numerical weather prediction, and I rank this as one of the toughest applied physics problems that humanity has been able to somewhat successfully solve. Carlo is nodding. He and I come from a somewhat similar background, so we probably agree on this. The climate system is much more complicated because you have things happening in the ocean that we barely started measuring. Ocean scientists often like to say that the ocean below a depth of 200 meters is significantly less explored than the surface of Mars. This is how little we know about it. The land surface is perhaps better understood, but it is enormously heterogeneous because you have forest here, then you have a parking lot, then you have a golf course, you you all know how the land surface looks, and it is a nightmare to model and understand.
Well, it's changing all the time, right? And then also, you, as you say, there's the kind of the mesh of the scale of it is so fine. How on earth can you manage to survey that and try and understand?
Back to the issue on observations that you asked, Jeremy. We had a very interesting discussion going on in Sharm el-Sheikh that both Carlo and I were participating in, about whether it is right to monitor greenhouse gases using atmospheric observations. There are parties who are adamantly opposed to this. They want this to be monitored based on national self-reporting, which is what the Paris Agreement says should happen. I think that's a little bit naive. That's you were referring to your bank account earlier, Jeremy. It's like asking you to be the official record keeper of your bank account and let you say, okay, I have today $100,000, and from some unknown source, I got another 50,000, so now I have 150. This is not how anybody would propose to do accounting. You would have an entity independent of you keep those records for you. Carlo and I are both atmospheric scientists, and we believe that you should do this based on observation, measure what is coming, measure what's in the atmosphere, and try to estimate using measurements where it is coming in and where it is going out.
How do you measure it? Are you talking about devices on the ground? Or are we talking about satellites?
We're talking about the same way that you do weather prediction. You use observations all over the planet on the ground. You use satellites, you use aircraft, balloons, things that float on the ocean, things that swim under the ocean surfaces. You need an enormous heterogeneous mix of observations, and then you can do this. The science for doing this is well known.
I want to talk a little bit about the new space mission which is going to come up. Lídia, I think am I right to say that you need to go because you need to go and do some voting in the European Parliament? Is that right?
Exactly. Unfortunately, I have to.
You're officially excused to go and do your democratic duty.
Thank you very much. May I just let one last sentence about what Lars just mentioned about the importance of oceans. I've been saying this a lot, and there is no sustainable planet without sustainable oceans. They are crucial. They are vital. They are also one of the pillars to address climate change, in particular climate mitigation. But unfortunately, it seems like oceans are, as well as adaptation, they seem to be the two neglected topics every time we address climate change. But I think there was some also positive outcomes out of COP27 addressing exactly the role of oceans in this. So I wanted to leave with this positive message that it's not all negative after all, and that finally, and after a lot of pressure, oceans are becoming also central in the climate discourse. I say this because I come from Portugal, a country surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean and Spain, but just to underline that it is a very relevant topic and that finally countries are acknowledging it. So thank you very much for the invitation, and yes, I wish a good rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much for talking to us. It's been really nice to see you. Okay, all right. Well, we'll carry on talking about this satellite because I do like a good satellite. I'm a bit of a fan of space stuff, and we know that there's a mission from the European Space Agency called CO2M, which is going to be launching relatively soon, which is going to be doing some of this work of attempting to understand where we are in terms of actual emissions. Can you, Lars Peter, can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes. So we need good observational data on everything, the whole climate system, including the CO2 and the methane and where it comes in and out of the atmosphere. We have a network of surface stations that are distributed around the planet, but that will not provide us with enough geographical coverage to let us understand everything that we need to understand. The ground-based observing systems tend to be deployed where there's money. So Europe has very good coverage, North America has very good coverage, Japan has very good coverage, and you can fill in the rest of the blanks yourselves. And you can also guess where there's no good coverage, over the ocean, in Africa, much of South America, the small island states. And that is where a satellite mission can really help. It won't measure as accurately as you can do from the ground, but it can give you this beautiful coverage and geographical picture, and then you can piece that together. Mathematically, you piece that coverage together with the detailed, accurate information that you get from the ground, and then you really get somewhere. This is how we have been able to, during my career, to get from a stage where meteorologists were basically the jokes of any party, because people would ask them, why don't you just look out the window, because you can't predict the weather anyway. That was a running joke in my youth. Now we routinely plan our lives on weather prediction 7-10 days ahead. Billion-dollar decisions are riding on weather forecasts. This is a very serious business now, and we can do the same with and that's how we did it with for weather prediction. We pieced together satellite information with ground-based information, mathematical modeling. We can and should do the exact same thing for greenhouse gas monitoring. So
the goal is by the end of this decade that we're able to do that. You're able to give numbers on a pretty timely, regular basis.
It's not going to take until the end of the decade. I mean, Copernicus is a long way toward that goal already. And we are working with Copernicus to set up a global framework where we will have apples to apples comparison between what Copernicus is seeing, what the Japanese groups are seeing, what the American groups are seeing, the Chinese groups are seeing. So we will set up this sort of partly competitive, partly collaborative framework globally that we need in order to progress, and that we need in order to provide authoritative information to the parties of the UNFCCC.
Let me bring in Carlo on this one. Carlo?
Well, it's just, I mean, actually, Lars Peter said it all. It's just really using the successes of the weather prediction. So indeed, weather prediction is one of these areas where our ability to predict the future has improved dramatically over even just the last 20, 30 years. And it's an area where actually Europe, a bit like we were talking about Europe being the example in terms of pledges and emission. Well, on weather forecast, Europe is also at the forefront.
Yeah.
So we are in a very good position to exploit this technological leadership and use it in the context of the challenge of the moment, which is climate change. So using the same technology from the observation that the CO2M will provide, which are much more accurate, much more detailed in space and time, and in terms of spectral accuracy, we can use that information and inverse the problem and go from the concentration to the emissions, which is the real key element. And
so will we be able to identify particular points in particular countries, or is it on a, you know, how does that work? Is that the idea that you can say, okay, Belgium did this last year or last week or last month?
Yes, I think it's going beyond. Belgium is a medium to small size country, I would call it. I think we can go higher resolution than that. We can go to the size of a medium to large city, if you want, a small region where you will be able to provide constraint on the emission there. So then indeed, going back to what Lars Peter was saying, is like having an independent accountant looking at your bank account and saying, well, actually, this is the flow going in and this is the flow going out.
Yeah.
And this requires the technology in the satellite, requires the ability to use this information in a weather prediction, but also requires a good understanding of all these fluxes from the land surface, from the ocean that we were discussing about. So it's a big challenge, but we have the technology, we have the know-how, we have the scientists in Europe to tackle that problem. And indeed, we are in the process of doing it. So by 2027, at the latest, this will be operational.
Mia, can I bring you in on this? What will you do with that information? The scientists here are going to be creating this information, offering it to everybody. Then what happens?
I mean, that's great. The more accurate information we have, you know, the better science we can have and the better projections we can also have. So, you know, the more countries also use this accurate information provided by scientists, you know, that will really help also in the UNFCCC process and the climate negotiations to know exactly where we're at. But I think, you know, just going back a bit, you know, taking it back to what we should be doing. I think it's, there might be uncertainties about the exact level of emissions, but it's crystal clear that we need to do more. The trajectory that we're on is off, and so we need to do a lot more. And I think here again, the science is clear on the fact that we need to phase out fossil fuels. There are certain things that we need to do in order to get to where we should be getting, and that's, I think, still very much, well, it has been brought in the discussion, but it's still missing to a large extent in the negotiations, for example.
You're right. I'm going to wrap things up, but I think one question the same for all of you. What needs to happen between now and when we possibly all meet in Dubai next year at COP28? Although a question about whether we should even have these meetings or not is another one for another conversation. But what needs to happen, what is going to happen between now and next November when the next meeting happens? Lars Peter.
I agree very much with what Lídia said. We need much more active climate diplomacy. I'm old in my career as an atmospheric scientist and now as a UN bureaucrat, but I'm fairly new to the COP landscape. And something that I learned much more about this year is how central a role the presidency actually has in shaping the final outcome. I did not know that the UNFCCC Secretariat was not involved in the drafting of the final outcome document, because I've been working mostly through SAPSTA, where the UNFCCC Secretariat plays a key role. This is in the hands of the presidency, so I think it is critical for Europe and other, let me call them progressive groupings related to this to climate mitigation, that they work very actively with the UAE presidency right now, because this will be vital in shaping the outcome. In terms of what needs to happen in the longer term, I think all of us on this call agree with this. I mean, we need to take mitigation much more seriously, and I agree with Mia that behind all the different things that you could do, I mean, fossil fuel emission reduction is non-negotiable. That absolutely needs to happen. But there are parties who will be dragging their feet, and I'm phrasing it as politely as I possibly can. And
that is polite.
Yeah, and we need to work with the presidency and make sure that we get some headway there.
Yeah,
Will that be successful in the UAE? Let's see.
Carlo, what needs to happen, what will happen between now and the next COP?
Yeah, well, this is, I mean, what will happen requires a kind of forecast maybe I'm not yet an expert on. But what needs to happen is going back to this plot we have seen before, where the CO2 and methane concentration keep going up, irrespective of our meeting at the previous COP. So what needs to happen is for this curve to level off and eventually stabilize, if not decreasing. And the only way we know about that is to reduce our emission. So this is what needs to happen. It's very clear. And I guess what can happen, and the decision made at COP27 are playing a role in that, is to for all the parties involved to take this observation as a reference, as a key element, is a fact, is our ground truthing, right? So that's the proof of the pudding. Is really looking at how these are going to change over time that will allow us to decide whether we are doing enough or not. And at the moment we aren't. So that's my thinking here. So take more seriously between now and COP28 the observation we have as a ground truthing for our decisions.
Mia?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things need to happen. We've now seen that governments can act in an emergency mode in times of crisis. We've seen this with the COVID pandemic. We've seen it now with the energy crisis that has followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Governments can do things that were previously completely unthinkable. I mean, think of these massive lockdowns. I'm not advocating we should do lockdowns to reduce emissions, although that did reduce emissions, but we need to do things that were previously unthinkable. That's really the mode we need to be in. We're in the middle of an emergency and we need to treat it as such. Then I think the diplomatic efforts that were mentioned are also very important. We've seen, for example, with the COP26 presidency of the UK, there was a huge diplomatic effort there, and we need to see a similar broad diplomatic effort to bring countries on board. Major players like the US and China need to talk. There were some positive signs now about that in COP27, and that clearly needs to continue. And the major emitters need to put forward new targets well ahead of COP28. And again, I would just close and say, we need to have a discussion about fossil fuels. We cannot meet the 1.5 degree goal without phasing out fossil fuels. There's been a good conversation about it at COP27, but unfortunately, the final text did not include language about phasing out oil and gas. There have been some positive movements. For example, now the US, apparently, as the world's largest oil and gas producer, would be in favor of a text to phase out fossil fuels. Whether that happens in practice remains to be seen, but we need to see that kind of leadership also from major oil and gas producers to slowly start phasing out so that we can meet the 1.5 degree limit.
Message understood, I think very clear. Thank you very much to Mia Moisio, who leads the Climate Action Tracker project at the NewClimate Institute. Thanks also to Carlo Buontempo, the director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service, and also to Lars Peter Riishøjgaard, the director of Earth System Branch at the World Meteorological Organization. And then also thank you to Lídia Pereira, the Portuguese MEP who joined us earlier. Fantastic talking to you on this Climate Now live today. For everybody who's watching and you want to keep up to date with how our planet is changing, have a look at euronews.com/climate now, where I have an update on the facts and figures from Copernicus every month about what's really happening, the data, the facts, because as we were saying in all of this conversation, that's what we need to look at. We need to keep listening to the science and moving in the right direction. So thanks for watching. Let us know your comments and I'll see you soon.